I'll give you a countdown. Here we go. And
The countdown makes me feel really on the spot.
okay, well then I'll just give you.
Do that. Do the. Yeah.
Coming to you. Do you want me to do the?
I much prefer the television kind of.
That's what they do.
Yeah, I know. That's
okay.
I cut my teeth there.
All right, here we go.
You don't tell Denny Anderson 3, 2, 1.
No, you don't do that to Denny. How dare you?
You would never.
He's a legend. And I disagree.
I disagree. You don't have the right to my opinion.
I'm just trying to save the world, man.
I don't know. Maybe.
It's legit.
Can I finish?
Can't finish. Hold on. Fine.
And now, disagree to disagree. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Disagree to Disagree. As always, I am Jason, and with me is my good friend Brett.
Hello, and good day to you, my buddy.
We've dropped the accents now.
We're done. Maybe that's a little Canadian there.
Yeah,
buddy.
It was a boot.
I'm not your buddy guy. I'm not your guy, friend.
Okay, we digress.
As usual.
Today's episode is brought to you by the all-purpose conservative boogeyman, Antifa, who remind you, we're everywhere. They're well organized and they're bringing the show to us, Brett.
Okay, all right. They're the sponsor. Thank you, Antifa. Please check us out on our social media sites, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at the D2D podcast. 2 is numerical on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at the D2D podcast.
And you can find us anywhere you get your podcasts, Apple, Spotify, Google, and the like. Today, Brett, we are talking about bias. Everybody has it. Everybody is biased. We like certain things. We dislike certain things. It's a cognitive shortcut. Our biases are oftentimes, very helpful. I would go so far as to say that we are bias-based algorithms. Humans are. We react and respond to our biases. A lot of times we know what we're reacting and responding to, but a lot of times we're kind of unaware of maybe the bias that is driving our action, or if not unaware, kind of willfully blind to some of our biases. So today I'm looking forward to talking about bias with you.
Well, it's almost like a certainty, isn't it? I mean, we can pretty much say it's one of the guarantees in the human existence is that bias exists within and without us. I almost feel like if you were to look at it from an evolutionary standpoint, and all the fundamentalist Christians are probably banging their heads with their Bibles right now, but I think throughout our evolution, a bias has served as almost a survival mechanism mentally for us in order to be discerning in what is around us and within nature in order to identify dangers. And as we now are in the modern world, especially with the information age, because as we talked about in previous episodes, we are in the information age, is that acceleration or something that Coast to Coast founder Art Bell used to call the quickening, where everything was happening faster and faster. And now we're paying attention to 15 million different things a day. And now that survival mechanism of being discerning sometimes works for and against us.
Yeah, that bias filter is being taxed these days.
Yeah.
And things like social media are almost bias amplifiers, because if you like something and you click on it, pretty soon you just get the kind of stuff that you've been clicking on.
Isn't that how it works, though?
Yeah,
I mean,
that is how it works.
It's designed to keep reinforcing.
Yeah, and the consequence of it is it amplifies your bias over time. So why do people get bias? I mean, you talked about like the evolutionary reason, I guess maybe not why, but where. We can get bias from a lot of places. We spend years as children going to school being taught certain things. We come up in certain religions being taught certain things. Our family can have biases within it that we pick up. The media, we've talked a lot about the media bias. So we are destined to be bias. And there's a lot of good to be had from bias, like you said. But I think some of the things that would be fun to talk about today, for me in particular, is confirmation bias, which we have brought up before, because I think that's the one that's being so exacerbated by this information age, where people are bombarded with all kinds of stuff, and it's just natural to gravitate towards
the
things,
buzzword right now. It's
the
the
things that
universally
you
accepted one.
agree with.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just human nature. but it can lead us to some pretty non
Interesting places.
yeah, it can lead to some cognitive dissonance. Let's just say that. So I think a good talk about confirmation bias. I've got some examples. I've got some examples of confirmation bias in myself. You know,
Y- yeah.
I'm that I would be happy to unleash. I know that you've got a few things that are going to be tasty for us to talk about as well. And then later on, maybe we can talk about a lot of the different types of biases that psychologists identify.
You make an interesting point when you were talking about the social media, and I'm always kind of curious as to why the designers did what they did in order to be like, you click on something, oh, they must like this, so we're going to keep throwing it at them, and how, especially with all the studies and research that goes into it with the science of psychology, why people gamble, for example, the lights and the bing bam booms and the things like that, in order to keep people pressing on the button. And it almost works like slot machines online with Facebook and
Absolutely,
Twitter.
they're addictive.
But why would they not consider, and how could they not foresee the
Well,
ramifications of it,
I'm
though?
I'm sure they did consider it. And
It's a good business model.
bottom line, it's clickbait is a good business model.
You
Yeah,
know,
and that's why. And so it's like this high sugar diet for our brain.
it almost comes back to what we were talking about in our history series. Humans aren't very good at foresight, and how could you not foresee how this could end up being what largely most people think is detrimental? I mean, look at all the backlash against social media, and on the news you hear about, oh, we got to regulate and take away the monopolies of the big tech, and just how this keeps getting reinforced all of a sudden. Seems like a kind of a tug of war a little bit.
I don't know how you put that genie back in the bottle.
I
You
don't know
know,
if you can.
it's crazy. And so confirmation bias. I'm going to give an example because basically what this means is we have a predilection to focus our attention on things that already back up what we believe to be true. And so this is why Fox viewers are willing to accept that the Green New Deal and windmills are responsible for the Texas blackouts. And it's also the same phenomenon that makes me not really want to look at Governor Cuomo's hidden death rate because that doesn't give me any ammunition or affirmation. But you better believe if it was Ron DeSantis's hidden count or somebody that I had a political grudge with, I'd be deep in the weeds on that. And the only difference is because of political affiliation or side of the spectrum. And it's so glaringly obvious to me that those are my actions. And yet, how do you not have that kind of bias? I think you're better at it than me.
I don't. I'd try to be. I don't know if I'm any better or worse than anybody else, but I think I do. I mean, people who kind of fall under confirmation bias. I mean, they just, like you were saying, they tend to keep listening to information that confirms what they believe they already know, or how they interpret the information that they're already receiving in a way that confirms this reality that they have. And this by far is considered one of the most widely labeled biases that exist out there. And I fully admit that people on the right of center, have those biases and confirmation biases as well. Because especially when you look at like the news cycles, an interesting kind of tagline came out this past week on a Twitter feed called Rasmussen Reports, and they were looking at how they showed all the four same big liberal networks, MSNBC, ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, how they didn't cover the Cuomo thing. Like it just was not covered. And then people on Twitter who were on the left were saying, well, what about Fox News? They weren't really covering a whole lot of the allegations against Trump. And right there, you can kind of see what you're talking about a little bit. And
Oh
it's
yeah, media selects and
people,
gives people the diet that they know that they want. It's you know, love him or hate him, Rupert Murdoch and what's his nuts, Roger Ailes.
Roger Ailes.
They changed that landscape, and Rush Limbaugh and people like that. news has become so partisan and so just boutique. People go where they know they're going to be affirmed. There is no,
But how can people just the thing is everybody kind of knows nowadays. You're going to get the liberal point of view from these networks, you're going to get the conservative point of view from these networks. And people are now very aware of confirmation bias now. It's been thrown out there and people have been informed about it a lot, especially during the Trump administration. So how is it that people still go about and they still fall in these trappings?
because I think people are willfully blind to it. I think a lot of people are just happy to be in
It's safe
their
and
information
comfortable. It's their
silo.
own
Yeah.
little kind of pillow that they just kind of lay down on.
Yeah. And it's easy. Social media and the modern
Well, it's
media
for the lazy
landscape
person almost.
makes it very, very easy to just wallow in your confirmation bias. And it's hard to admit when you're doing that. I don't like it when I find it in myself, but I'm easy, or I'm quick to point it out in others, you know. So, I, I, and if we're saying we all have confirmation bias or we all have bias, it's just I think it's helpful to identify it. How do you identify bias in yourself? I think it's by studying your reactions to things.
You got to be really self-aware. You
You
have
have
to
to-
be very honest with yourself.
Yeah. What headlines are you clicking on? What feeds are you reading and not reading?
Like keeping a tally, you're meaning?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that helps you recognize what your bias is. At least that's been helpful for me.
Yeah. I know that you were kind of mentioning, and if I may, I know you were saying that confirmation bias is something that you feel like I'm better at than you. And I don't know if that's true or not, but I do know, and there's a great video on YouTube that I highly recommend people go, and it's a good primer on types of cognitive biases. It's called Practical Psychology. It's a YouTube channel. And the title of the video is 12 Cognitive Biases Explained. And it's a very good way of going about it. Again, it's practical psychology. And one of them, I think I do have. I'm pretty sure that I do. And I know that I kind of drift in and out between some of the other ones. It'd be ignorant of me to say otherwise. But the one that I'm referring to is called the blind spot bias. And this is someone who kind of falls in this category is one who thinks, when asked if they're biased, that person believes that they are less biased than the average person. Okay. I see you smiling over there right now.
Well, it's the same
And-
bias that lets people think that they're better at their jobs than they are and smarter than they are, right?
Well, and they're more likely to base their judgment on facts and statistics. Okay. And you are biased because you think that you are less biased than everyone else. That's what it is. And it's funny because we've had these conversations
This
before.
gets back to Socrates' knowing that you know nothing.
And how many times have I said that throughout the seasons of
Buddy,
the show?
it's our lodestar. We share that in common.
So I fully admit that, because as I was researching this in preparation for the show, and we talked about this where we had to be kind of honest with ourselves a little bit. And this one just stuck out like a sore thumb because I'm always telling you, I read stuff on this side, I read stuff on this side, and then I try to come together and figure it out and using facts and statistics and historical knowledge, the timeline of things. And I feel I'm less biased because I'm more analytical in that way. But by saying that, I'm being biased against everyone else because they're not prescribing to that particular methodology. And I admit that. I admit I have bias.
Yeah, we all have bias. You were sharing a story before we started rolling about what I would classify as confirmation bias. You want to talk about that a little bit, or?
I think this falls under a category called availability heuristic bias, where people tend to overestimate the information that they have. It's important to note here before we move forward that this does have a racial component to it. And I by no means bring this up to disparage or shame or hurt anyone. This is merely within the discussion that we're having about bias and even involving statistics and media and thoughts of how people reflect on those things. All right. So this is an article from Paul Joseph Watson of Summit.News. He is a right of center journalist out of Britain. And he wrote an article about this new poll that's highlighting, as he terms, the gulf between what people believe and the reality that is found in this poll that was taken by Skeptic magazine through one of the typical channels when they do national and selective polling. They found that 44% of liberal-minded voters think that cops kill almost 40 times more unarmed Black American males than what the actual figures really are. So if you want to look at the figures, according to the database called Mapping Police Violence, which is compiled by data experts and activists and police officers in the United States, where these police officers in the U.S. killed 27 unarmed Black men by any means in 2019. 27. 13 unarmed Black American males were fatally shot in the same year by cops. But however, according to this poll, where 44% of people who describe themselves as liberal, very, very liberal, said that it was in the thousands.
So this is like a poll that it's got to have like a A, B, C, D, you know? So do you believe it's like 10, 100, 1,000, 100,000, you know? That does seem weird to me, but also, if you think about it, that's an absurd amount of people being killed every year. One is too many.
One is too many.
And
fully agree with you on that.
And we've seen the disparity, and not to discount that at all, but it is interesting the cognitive trap people fall into, how somebody who wants the narrative to be these villainous police would have an inflated number be believable to them. Even though if you really think about it, that's an unbelievably high number. But you want to believe it.
Yeah, and it's such a touchy subject, and the only reason that I bring it up is just because it's a really good example of what bias can
bias
be and
is
how
everywhere.
it can and how it can influence things, and conservatives are just as guilty of that. I mean, look at the QAnon supporters, for example. I mean, what better example than what we can have for that? I mean, we had a whole episode about it and how there is this small minority segment of conservative thought that believed an individual was feeding them information, and anything outside of that, trying to prove it wrong, was disinformation. And it just, I laugh.
You got your conspiracy in my bias.
And I want to make it very clear.
You got your bias in my conspiracy.
I'm not laughing because both of these things are so extremely serious. I laugh at humans in general.
Oh, how can you not?
Because it's almost gallows humor at this point. Really is. Because of the ridiculousness of it. I mean, there is undoubtedly Black American males that are getting killed by police nationwide every year.
Oh, and racism itself is a type of bias.
And racism exists.
It's one of the worst biases, to be biased against somebody for their skin color
Totally
or their religion. You know,
Totally
those are such outlandish biases that we're not even really talking about.
Racism is the best example of that. You're right.
We're more interested in like the hidden biases, or the things that you don't think about as much. But yeah, bias is everywhere. And I know that your video has a bunch of different types of bias. I was reading a Psychology Today article with a bunch of different types of bias. I would like to talk about some of those because they're very interesting. Very interesting, and I would probably cop to one or two of them.
Just one or two, huh?
Well, we'll see. We'll see. You call me out. You bias shame me.
You call me out all the time. It's a give and take. That's what makes it special to have a conversation with you.
All right. Well, let's get into all these other kinds of biases. Is it a plural of bias? Is it biases?
Biases?
Biasi?
Can we go to the judges here for like on Jeopardy? Can we go to the judges? Is that answer correct?
I think biasi wins just on style points.
Let's go with that.
Okay.
Yeah.
I didn't realize until doing a little research for this show how many different types of identified bias there are out there.
Yeah, I saw a bunch of different ones as well. There was like lists with 20, and I think the shortest one I saw was 10.
Do you want to just like swap some bias?
Let's just swap some bias.
Let's swap bias.
All right.
You go ahead.
Well,
what you got?
So again, I want to reference the video. It's called Practical Psychology. It's a good primer. I mean, again, a lot of these different biases have different sciences and different studies behind them. So it's a good one to kind of just get a little bit of a primer along with that Psychology Today article that you have for reference. But one that's interesting I saw was one called ostrich bias. And I think by just the name itself, it kind of implies...
You're putting your head in the sand?
A little bit. It's sort of a decision, conscious or unconscious, where to ignore the negative information. Whether it's just you don't want to watch the news because it's always negative, or you don't want to pay attention to a certain something because it's negative towards your side.
Well, that's confirmation bias,
Well,
right?
it-
By another name, or
Well, it's an indication where we only want to consider the positive aspects of something, but also ignore negative information as an outlier. It's another way where you're deliberately ignoring something. And sure, I think it's a form of confirmation bias, as confirmation bias is a form of cognitive bias, where this ostrich bias is sort of another form of cognitive bias in and of itself. So yeah, I think there's people out there that stick their head in the sand. They're like, stick their fingers in the ears, for example, and no, 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 I'm not going to listen to this. No, no, no. And I think at times I know early on in my life I did that, and it changed once I got about 18, and then other political events happened after that. I can think of family members, and I'm sure you probably could too, that will refuse to look at something.
absolutely. Yeah. I like the actor observer bias, where if you are the actor in a situation, you're much more likely to see your actions as the result of external factors and situations. But if you are the observer watching somebody go through something, you're much more likely to attribute their actions to internal factors like their overall disposition. I hadn't really given that much thought before reading about it, but it has the ring of truth.
For you?
I think in general,
Okay.
I don't know. I'm sure I probably do like have an example of, I'm sure everybody probably has an example of that type of bias
That's
if
fair.
they really think about it. But that's the thing about bias is sometimes you're not aware, or it's not at the front of your mind what is driving your thought process.
It's interesting in reading the article that we both read from Psychology Today, and then referencing the video that I've been talking about, which is a nice primer. Again, for the millionth fucking time, I got to stop saying that.
A primer. It's a primer.
So, and with the different research that we've done, one of the things that's sort of interesting and has a real commonality is how the subconscious gets brought up a lot, and how unaware people are in doing these certain things. And it makes me a little bit reflective to go, well, just how much power does the subconscious have over the conscious mind then at that point?
Oh, so much. So much.
So if the subconscious is something that one is not aware of, how can you be aware of something that's unawareable?
Unawareable. That would be a good t-shirt.
I know it's probably not a word. I'm
No,
guilty of making up words.
It's
but-
fantastic. I mean, it's right
you
up.
see what I'm saying,
It's
though?
right up there with bias eye.
But you see what I'm saying? It's sort of like, how are you supposed to try to live your life as a person who doesn't let bias influence them, and do so in a conscious fashion when a lot of these things are subconscious?
Well, and I think that's why it gets back to how do you identify your bias? You do that by being very aware of your reactions to things, because you can do a little hindsight backtracking on your reaction and be like, why did I react that way? Oh, and it's almost something that you have to remind yourself of after it happens, because it is a subconscious thing in so many ways.
But that drives someone like me, and I use this loosely, not literally, it drives me a little crazy, because as someone, as you know, who's tends to be pretty over analytical in most aspects of
Just a tad.
yeah, oh yeah, just a little bit. I'm sure there's people out there laughing who know me that they're like, oh yeah, it's true. But then to try to be constantly aware and analyze those things, a person sort of needs to kind of take a breather and relax on themselves a little bit. But how long do you let that relaxation go before you kind of get back to it and let's just check ourselves again? And it almost feels like it'll be too much of a mental chore at that point, and it'll be an energy drain. So maybe here's a question to pose to you. How do you think?
That's why bias is part of the program. It's meant
Well,
to keep
yeah, but how do we go about our daily lives then in trying to still be good people, be aware of these things, but just live our lives daily without just constantly analyzing whether or not we're exhibiting bias in everything that we do?
Well, I think it's just like and I brought this up last episode, where I've been checking my privilege and now I'm trying to check my bias. It's just something that you can become better at being aware of. And by being aware of it, that's some power over the behavior.
But see, that's interesting, because I've heard these things and it almost feels like you're just kind of following what people do in the media. and they're constantly telling you, check your white privilege. No, check your biases. Do you feel like that you're
Well,
influenced by that sort of social commentary on the large that sort of brings these subject matters up? Because I would say I wouldn't have thought about those things if they're not being brought up and talked about.
Totally. I mean, I think these past couple of years have been eye-opening for a lot of white people when they think back on just the
Well, not just white
interactions
people,
they've
but
had in their
people in general.
yeah, but just talking about white privilege, if that's where you were
Yeah.
going with that. But
Mhm.
I think that these things are things that are there, but we don't think about. Either we don't like to think about them, or we just are they're acting in our subconscious. And when they're brought to our attention, all we can do is really try and analyze them and see where they're coming from. Is that a troublesome reaction I just had? Or is that a very honest, real reaction I had? So it's nothing that you're ever gonna, nobody's gonna ever be rid of bias. Bias is part of the human experience. It's just when it becomes unhealthy and you get into these weird magical thinking or cognitive feedback loops where it's helpful to check your bias. Just like Karens need to check their white lady privilege. I mean, it's the same thing. It's the same. You don't realize why you feel like you can be that way until you think about it and be like, oh, okay, maybe I should stop exhibiting this behavior.
Karen's is only like it's white ladies
It's
exclusive. I thought it was any.
I guess it's any middle class person,
If
but it's
it,
most
if
often a
I just learned
white
something today.
person calling in
Okay,
something on a non-white person.
I just learned something, and that's a good lead in from what you're saying because it sort of brings to another type of bias, selective
I haven't
perception
forgotten
bias.
about you, Karen.
But that's sort of brings up something called selective perception bias, which is a form of bias that causes people to perceive the messages and actions according to their frame of reference. And these, when people fall into this, they tend to overlook and forget something that contradicts their beliefs and or perceptions. It's almost like you're mentally self-gaslighting your own self.
Yeah, and I feel like I know a lot of people that do that.
It seems like a common thing, which is interesting because when we talk about these and we're kind of explaining the definitions of them, we can think of people that we've met in our lives that sort of fall into these categories, or just people in general that we see in the media that influences us.
Yeah, and a lot of times I can identify these behaviors in myself. The halo effect is if you have a positive first impression, then all of your subsequent impressions are given a little halo. So this is often, like if there's a pretty girl, and then you are more likely to think that she's smart and witty. And if you don't have an initial good first impression, you are more likely to shut down the second impressions because people really only allow one impression.
Wow. Yeah, that's almost word for word of something that's called anchoring bias.
I got anchoring bias as a different
one. That's
where
it's
it's
funny
like
how these things kind of bleed together, though, don't they? a little
yeah,
bit?
I think that they're very closely related. They're cousins. They shouldn't get married. But the
Good
anchoring
rule to live by, Jason.
the anchoring bias is if you anchor on to a bad piece of information and then you build a case around that.
The first information that they receive,
Yeah.
they tend to rely.
Yeah. And I think that happens a lot too, both on the left and the right.
Oh,
I mean, you see
yeah.
that in the Tucker Carlsons and Rachel Maddows of the world on a nightly basis.
two good examples maybe of that. Yeah. Yeah. But I think if people are kind of looking for a catch-all in how to maybe deal with this, I sort of think of the golden rule: do unto others as you would have done unto yourself. And I think maybe that's something small and helpful as a starter to try to figure out how to go through your life to not have these things. It's not that bias is bad. I think it's like any other tool. It can be used as a tool or a weapon. And bias is one of those things. And so if you think of somebody else and you're in their shoes, how would you want it to be done to you? And that can help in discerning the information that you choose to consistently look at, whether it's one side or another exclusively, or both sides exclusively, that this constant sort of give and take that you have to have with yourself and being aware of what you are inside and what you are on the outside and how you present and how you absorb the
Yeah.
world around you.
Totally. One of my favorite in this article, and it isn't really a bias. I mean, I guess it's a bias in thinking you're better than you are, but it's called the Dunning-Kruger effect.
Hmm.
And this is where people lack the self-awareness to accurately assess their skills. So they often wind up overestimating their knowledge or ability. For example, and I'm reading this verbatim, it's not uncommon to think that you're smarter, kinder, or better at managing others than the average person.
Only I would probably fall in that, and that's another bias that I might lean into now and then. I think there's probably a number of coworkers out there that would agree that I have done that. So that's something that I would probably admit that I drift in and out of.
I absolutely don't suffer from that.
Oh, hold on a second.
You know how much better I am than most people.
Oh my God. You killed me, dude. You absolutely killed me.
What else you got? You got any other biases that tickle you? Or are we kind of reaching the end of our convo here?
Well, how about the bandwagon effect? I think this is another big one,
Okay.
like confirmation bias. It's sort of that old adage, well, if everybody else is jumping off a bridge, are you going to do it too? When someone sort of says that, they're sort of checking your bandwagon effect bias right there, which is generally people who do or believe in something, not because they actually do believe it, but because the rest of the world believes it. It's sort of like people voting for a certain candidate because it's popular in society today. As a conservative, with my bias, that's how I view liberal voting. We have all the celebrities and you have all the media, which is largely, in my biased opinion, most mainstream media is liberal. And so when you have this bombardment, then it's the popular thing to do. Vote for Joe Biden because Orange Man is bad.
Wow, you went a weird place with that.
I did, but I'm also admitting the biases and how that thought process goes out.
Well, you're pointing out a bias I don't necessarily agree with. I don't think that was just the larger narrative that we all saw going on. And we've talked ad nauseum about how the media
But
reports
basically,
the story
people
they want,
voting
but
for
people
someone
wanna hear
because
it.
it's largely popular is a form of bandwagon effect bias.
Yeah,
Where you're
and-
doing what the rest of the cool kids are doing.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it's much more on a local level. Yeah, like what are the cool kids doing? I want to be in the clique. I don't want to be on the outside. It's harder to be the person that stands alone.
Yeah, well, maybe I disagree a little bit there with you. But,
All right.
that's okay. That's all
right.
right.
Man, you really do like to spend your time bashing the mainstream media. It's
I
like,
do.
It's like you've got something against, like, when you say that, it's like
I see it as a pejorative, don't I?
you do, and
Yeah.
and you hate when people use things that you feel are pejorative.
And that's a check
and-
on my bias right
and
there.
and you throw it at me all the time, and I'm like, that's
Mm-hmm.
like triple checking your sources and the things that mainstream media does before it releases things. That's like scientific consensus to me. That's like being in the mainstream of thought because
Okay.
because it is the most proper thought. It's the most logical, well put together thought. But that is maybe a conversation for another day.
Right. I mean, that kind of goes back in other episodes we've done on media bias and some of the earlier parts where we were talking about media bias in and of itself right there. But I mean, think of it as my joke from earlier when I was kind of joking about fundamentalist Christians banging the Bible against their head. I mean, I'm a Christian. I believe in Lord Jesus Christ. Okay, I do. So is it biased in me to think, well, I'm Christian, it's okay for me to kind of tell a Christian joke? Or is it okay to say, because Christians are usually a foil in a lot of comedy nowadays? You don't see another bias for some Christians is that, well, you don't see jokes thrown around about them in the mainstream media, but Christians, they get bashed all the time. And I think some Christians do have a bias in that, but I don't think that's mutually exclusive. I think a lot of other religions and other people who feel that they're downtrodden upon and put upon become sensitive to the things that are around them, whether it's real or it's perceived. And it's such an interesting subject. I really enjoyed talking about this. And this was kind of a real inner perspective, sort of self-awareness exercise for me when sort of going about and preparing for this episode. And this was an episode that was your idea. I didn't come up with it. And so, maybe you had political motivations to have the real Brett come out and that we got that conservative admitting his bias.
No,
But
it came
but
to
it was
me
a good
because,
idea that you had, dude. It really was, and thank you.
well, it feels like so many of the conversations that we have had over the past several months have their underpinnings in bias. And we never just talk about it as a thing that exists.
So to
And
talk around it, you're saying?
yeah,
Yeah.
and it undergirds so much of what we talk about. So yeah, I liked this conversation as well. Let's get out while the getting is good, shall we?
Please check us out at Twitter, Facebook, and
Sorry.
you
Sorry.
always derail me because of my how I say
I
Twitter.
feel like you lean into that now.
Now I feel like it's just instinctual because I've been doing it so much. So how about let's try it again? Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at the D2D podcast. Once again, at the D2D podcast. 2 is numerical.
And check us out wherever you get your podcasts. Disagree to disagree at buzzsprout.com. You can find it there as well. All right, buddy.
Look forward to the next conversation. Next conversation is going to be the last episode of the season.
Yeah, a bit of a wrap up.
Yeah, so we're going to kind of have a remembrance episode where we've been, where we are now, and topics that we kind of covered. I think
Oh.
it's going to be a good episode. Please tune into that. That'll be good to kind of look back.
A lot of laughter, a lot of tears.
Well, we'll find out. I'm not going to hug you.
We're going to burn some incense.
No. If we're doing a drum circle, I'm going to leave.
All right, buddy. Well, until next time,
Godspeed, Jason.
goodbye, Brett. Lodestar just sounds like a star taking a shit.
Ew.
I
Never
can,
thought of it that way.
I can picture the emoji.